Hey everyone, good morning. Thank you, Karina, for your thoughtful videos on prayer throughout this sermon series. Life is slowly changing, and we're starting to be able to get out a little more. I really hope you enjoyed the warm weather last week. The sermon series we're in right now is called Authentic Prayer. And in this series, we've been talking about some prayers and some ways of praying where we come to God authentically. We take our masks off with God, and we sit in the presence of God with nothing hiding who we are. And that can be a really scary concept. I remember in my early 20s hearing a speaker, Pastor John Carr, and he was sharing with us his experience of prayer. And he said that he'd learned to be honest with God. I remember him saying that God knows the truth about him anyways, so there's no need to pretend and to hide from God. I think that was the first time I'd ever heard someone say something like that. And as I heard him speak, I understood at some level that this would be a hard thing for me to do. But I didn't think it was as hard as it was. I then started looking at who I appeared to be when I spent time with God in prayer. Today, even individuals can have very slick marketing strategies. It's hard to separate the individual from their brand. But my strategies with God weren't very slick or even very original. When I came before God, I was the good girl. I was the one who didn't break the rules. I was the one who memorized Bible verses and worked for the gold star. I was the one who asked so many questions in Sunday school because I thought that knowing about God meant knowing God. This continued for many years as I learned and perfected the art of drive-by devotions. If I prayed quick prayers and then just kept talking, I didn't really have to know who God was, and God did not really have to know who I was. If I spent too long with God, I might have started asking God some of the big questions of my life. It was easier to just have a distant relationship with God. I wonder if anyone's using that strategy with God right now. We're going through something right now as a world that those of us who are alive don't really know much about. We have things going on inside of us that we do not even recognize. I've heard people talk about the loneliness they are experiencing in social isolation. They thought that they knew what loneliness felt like, but then this happened, and the loneliness is excruciating. Are you talking about those kinds of things with God? Are you talking about what you're really going through and how you really feel with God? Or are you just talking with God about the social niceties? Can you tell God the truth, even if it's not nice? Last week, we looked at the ancient prayer practice of lamenting. Lamenting is a way of praying that helps us to pray more authentically. In the Hebrew Bible, there are lots of examples of prayers and laments, and they are not nice or pretty. I remember my early 20s, I decided I was going to read the book of Psalms all the way through. I did not make it through the whole book. I had understood Christianity in terms of victory and triumphalism. I didn't know how to understand all these Psalms of lament. They were horrible. People didn't speak to God with respect. They were not nice passages of Scripture. It's no wonder that I thought like that. Lamenting was not and is not something that is widely accepted and practiced. We want to sing happy songs. As one writer has said, church is not supposed to be the happiest place on earth. It's supposed to be the most honest place on earth. Lamenting is about telling the truth. It's about being honest. Churches don't sing a lot of songs of lament these days. They are prominent in the worship book of the Hebrew Bible, but they're not prominent in our song collections today. Dr. Soong-Chan Rah is writing in an American context, but I think we can see the application for the Canadian church. And he writes in his book on Lamentations that how we worship reveals what we prioritize. The American church avoids lament. Consequently, the underlying narrative of suffering that requires lament is lost in lieu of a triumphalistic, victorious narrative. So we want happy songs, songs of victory and triumph. But that's not the whole truth. Phil Zilla, in his book, The Roots of Suffering, picks up the same idea and says that we've lost the capacity to lament due to triumphalism. Phil also says that we've lost the language of lament and lost lament as a spiritual practice. When we lament, we often turn inward first. We look inside ourselves and we come to terms with our losses. So spiritual practices like taking long walks, praying, journaling, or writing poetry may help with lamenting. Lament is not a bad thing. It's an important response to God. Walter Brueggemann calls these lament songs songs of disorientation. Songs of disorientation are not pretty. They are not the verses you cross-stitch and hang on a wall. Who wants to stitch, "Why have you forgotten us completely, God? Why have you forsaken us these many days?" Do we really want to hang that on a wall? I think we'd much rather put up, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." But lamentation and lamenting is about telling the truth. It's about telling God, telling others, and telling ourselves the truth. We tell God the truth about what we don't want to happen in the world, or what we do want to happen in the world. We've been tracking along with the prophet Jeremiah and some of his lamentations in the book of Jeremiah and the book of Lamentations. And he's troubled by what is happening in his world. This is what it says in Lamentations 3, starting at verse 1. "How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she, who once was great among the nations. She who was queen among the provinces has now become a slave. Bitterly she weeps at night. Tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, there is no one to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her. They have become her enemies. After affliction and harsh labor, Judah has gone into exile. She dwells among the nations. She finds no resting place. All who pursue her have overtaken her in the midst of her distress." Israel at one time had been a great nation. That changed, and in Jeremiah's time, Jerusalem was completely destroyed by the Babylonians. All their crops were burned. They would not be able to grow crops for years. The temple was ransacked and destroyed. The Babylonians took as captive anyone that they thought would be capable of rebuilding Jerusalem. So they took educated people, priests, prophets. They took able-bodied people. Anyone who they thought could bring Jerusalem back to the way it was taken. And they left in Jerusalem who they thought was not capable of rebuilding the city. So they left the marginalized people behind. They left behind people with exceptionalities. They left behind those with physical disabilities and the extreme poor, like widows and orphans. And this is what Jeremiah is lamenting. So the people who were taken captive were taken to Babylon, which was the most sinful place they knew of. Babylon was always held up as the opposite of Jerusalem. And Jeremiah sat down and he wrote a letter to the captives in Babylon, and he said something quite provocative. He said, "Seek the peace and the prosperity of the city." Now, that doesn't sound provocative to us, but whenever it was written to seek the peace of the city, it was always talking about Jerusalem. Now, he was talking about seeking the peace and the prosperity of Babylon, and that was hard to swallow. Babylon was the epitome of everything that was wrong in the world. Well, one of the things that the Hebrew people had to learn while they were there was that they were still called to be God's people, even if they lived in what they thought was the most evil city of the world. They couldn't run away. They couldn't hide. They had to live out their life as the people of God amongst people that they considered evil. They were still called to pray and worship. They were called to get jobs, put down roots, buy property, and plan to stay for a while. Jeremiah let them know that they weren't to run away and they weren't to give up. They could still be God's people in the midst of this experience. At one point, they sit down by the waters of Babylon and they weep. They cried for all that they had lost in Jerusalem. They didn't know how to worship God in this new place. There was no temple. I'm sure they thought that God had let them down. They were in exile, displaced. They'd been removed from their traditional lands. The Babylonians had attempted to destroy their culture, and now the Babylonians wanted the Hebrew people to entertain them by singing their spiritual and cultural songs. So they hung up their instruments and they refused to sing. They prayed and they asked God to bless anyone that would take revenge on their captors. They're protesting the brutality that they experienced. Their song of lament called out to God for justice. They tell the truth about their experience and what they want from God. Well, about 300 years or so later, Jesus is arriving in Jerusalem, and he looks over the city, and we read that Jesus was lamenting and crying over Jerusalem. The situation, though, is very different. Jesus is not talking about what bad things the Babylonians did. Jesus is talking about the Hebrew people. He laments how they have killed the prophets and stoned the very people that God sent to help them. Jesus is talking about some of the failures of the Hebrew people. But notice his tone. There is no fire and brimstone or harsh judgment. Jesus is very vulnerable. He expresses his pain that these things have happened, and he says, "How often have I desired to gather your children together as the hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing." And Jesus wept over Jerusalem. Jesus didn't accuse Jerusalem. He lamented for Jerusalem. He wept over it. He wept for their hard hearts and their short-sighted ways. He wept that they had turned against God and against some of their own people. He weeps that their hearts and their eyes were closed. Well, I'm not sure where your story connects with my ramblings today. I think that there is a message in our scriptures today to keep things real. Lament helps us to do that because lament is about telling the truth. For you, it might be this idea of coming to God with nothing hidden that you think would be challenging. If it's hard, perhaps you could try writing God a letter. You may find it easier that way to express what you're experiencing. I was reading a book last week called Naked Before God, and it was talking about a church that took this seriously. And during their worship time each Sunday, one person shared their story. And the difference between this sharing and the kind of sharing we often hear is that people told the whole truth. They talked about their struggles with doubt and grief and addictions. They kept it real. They even confessed their sins to the congregation. And all of this was done in the spirit of love and truthfulness. And new people started coming to their church because of the authenticity and the vulnerability that was happening in their services. They learned to keep it real. Maybe you connect to the message this morning through the Hebrew people as they lamented everything that they had lost after being forcibly removed from Jerusalem. Maybe you aren't sure how to worship God in a new land. Maybe even though you've been in church most of your life, the culture has changed so much that you weren't sure how to worship and sing and to feel like you really belong. Listen to this lament written by a British church that was struggling with who they are in the midst of huge societal changes. Our God, we praise you. You have been our light, our guide, our strength for ages past. But what are we to do now? The room echoes. The pews are half empty. Some people have drifted away. Others have gone to be with you. And no one comes to fill the gaps they've left. We are exhausted with serving, keeping things going, and still people don't come. Have you changed? Why do you hide your face from us? We're tired. We can't keep doing all this. Oh God, Turn your face to us again. Act as you've acted in the past. For the sake of your glory, build up your church again, so that the world will know that you have not abandoned your people. Oh God, we trust in you. You are our refuge and our strength from age to age. This church learned to keep it real. They learned to tell the truth. Perhaps this morning you connected with the story of Jesus, looking out over Jerusalem and weeping. He saw their brokenness and he lamented that he had so often wanted to take them under his wing, like a mother hen does with her chicks. Perhaps it's the image of Jesus that you want to connect with this morning. The image of God, not judging, not yelling messages about their broken ways. What would need to change so that you could respond to the love that God offers? Could you allow God to put his loving arm around you and to hold you tight as a mother hen gathers her chicks? God wants to do that. That's the truth this morning.